afford this. So Jen had sent me a little bio on herself. So let me just read that. Jen Panaro is the founder of WasteWell, a self-proclaimed composting nerd, her words, not mine, and an advocate for sustainable living for modern families. She's also a serial library book borrower, as am I, and a messy gardener. Not so much for me, not a gardener. As a mom of 2 boys, she's passionate about helping families be more responsible stewards to their communities and the planet. She also owns Honestly Modern, an online space focused on eco-friendly living for modern families, and co-founded Raising Global Citizens. I love that name.
Thanks.
An organization that creates and curates resources to raise the next generation of responsible global citizens. After stumbling through learning how to compost at home and writing about it on her blog to make it easier for others to learn to compost, she launched WasteWell to create further educational resources and also provide composting services in her local community to help increase access to composting for those who do not have the time, resources, or ability to do it for themselves. So with that, just a little background. My name is Tree Sullivan. I'm on the board for Plastic Free Delaware. Feel free to like us on Facebook. Go to our website, plasticfreedelaware.org. Go to our Twitter account, and you can see all the things we do in Delaware to help minimize climate change and move to a zero waste world.
Very nice.
With that, have at it, Jen.
All right, let me share my screen and see if I can get this set up with you guys. So I want to come over here and we'll do this. Come on. It's not let me press the button. I want to do. Okay, so you guys can see the presentation now, right?
Except,
do
you see the presenter window thing, or is that just me? I'm trying, there you go, perfect.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so I am going to talk a little bit today about composting at home. We'll talk about some different ways to do it, why it's important, and leave some time for questions if you guys have any to ask. So, like Tree said, I'm Jen Panaro, that's me. I'm the owner of WasteWell and also Honestly Modern, and we're here to talk about some local curbside composting, or composting at home too. So here's the agenda. We'll start out with what and why. So what is composting? How does it work? Why is it important? Then we'll head over to how do you get started at home? What can you actually compost? What system is best? And then answer a few questions. What if, how do we know if composting is working properly? One of the biggest questions we get, especially in urban and suburban areas, is what about wildlife? What about pests? Aren't they going to, smell my trash and start eating it? So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then leave some time for some Q&A. Okay, so what and why? So what is composting? Composting is effectively nature's recycling process. So it's how nature breaks down organic waste, like our food scraps and our yard waste, and turns it into nutrients that can then feed the plants, support new growth, and start that cycle all over again. So as you can see on the right there, we sort of have, we have a carrot that's in the ground. We're going to eat that. There's going to be some scraps. There's a lot of nutrients and a lot of minerals and things still left in those food scraps. So we can put them in a compost bin, and the microorganisms in that compost bin, some worms, some bacteria, other types of organisms, will break down the carrot greens, for example, and turn them back into the simple nutrients that plants can absorb, right? A plant can't eat a carrot green, but once the microorganisms and the worms break it down, they can absorb all those nutrients through their roots and then create new plants. So that's kind of the sort of simple way of how composting, how the cycle of composting works. And if we think about it from the perspective of, I think one way to kind of visualize it is think about a tree in the forest, right? So we've got a leaf, it falls, it's on the forest floor, it breaks down, turns into soil, and then the tree absorbs those nutrients, creates more soil, and then gives us leaves next year. So that's sort of the cycle that we expect to see. That's nature's most sort of basic version of the cycle, and then we can do that with food scraps as well. So why does composting matter? There's a few different reasons why it's pretty important. So first of all, when we put our food scraps and yard waste, so things like leaves or tree branches, things of that nature, when we put that into a landfill, it doesn't have enough oxygen. We're going to talk about the sort of components of what a proper compost bin needs. One of those things it needs is plenty of oxygen. And that's because the microorganisms that break down the organic waste need oxygen to breathe, just like we do. So in a landfill, the oxygen is not present. So if you can imagine, you've got your food scraps and they get layered on top of trash and plastic and whatever else gets layered on top of those food scraps. They don't have, there's no oxygen in that environment anymore. And so those food scraps will actually break down very slowly in a process called anaerobic decomposition. And anaerobic decomposition releases methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas. So methane is a very potent greenhouse gas that the EPA says is at least 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So when we think about, all of the emissions from our cars and all of the carbon that we're releasing from fossil fuels and things like that, the methane that's coming out of a landfill is actually worse. Ooh, there's the thunder and lightning. I don't know if you guys can hear it in the background. So what we have coming out of the landfill is going to be actually even worse than what's coming out of our cars. Now, in fairness, there are some landfills that capture that methane and use it for energy, but that's not going to be the most sort of highest and best use of those food scraps. The second reason is our landfills are overflowing. We have so much waste and we just don't have a place to put it anymore. So even if we can capture the methane from the landfills, we don't have a lot of landfills anyways, and it's not really something we want to be creating a lot of new landfills. So composting can significantly reduce the waste. We see that, with most of our customers, composting reduces their waste from their kitchen waste by like 30 or 40% sometimes. And just to give you a personal anecdote, my husband, who's not like an eco person necessarily, he's not like a green team guy, he's just a regular guy. He has said to me so many times, I can't believe how little trash we have now that we started composting. He's like, you need to tell everybody about this. And he was like, I don't understand necessarily why that happens, but I'm not joking. We have maybe a family of 4, 1 trash bag a week, maybe. We take our trash out to the street once every 3 weeks. Sometimes we forget, and then we're like, oops. So, we do still have trash. We are not a zero waste family, but just by composting and sort of thinking about, what is going in our trash bin, we've seen our waste decrease like crazy. So that's the second thing, right? Our landfills are just overflowing and we need to reduce the waste and find other places to put it that are more effective and more environmentally friendly. The third reason is composting rebuilds our healthy soil. So soil that is dry and has had all of the nutrients absorbed out of it doesn't absorb a lot of water, it doesn't retain a lot of moisture, and it's not really feeding our plants very well either. There's just not a lot of life in that soil to feed the plants that are growing in it. And soil can actually be a really great source of filtering, essentially, for the water that's in our waterways. So healthy soil, it reduces erosion, it protects our ecosystems, it cleans our water supplies, and it acts as a carbon sink. So when we put when I say my carbon sink, is basically a healthy soil absorbs a lot more carbon from the air than effectively dead soil or unhealthy soil. So when we compost, we make that soil healthier. We're going to also pull more carbon into that soil and out of the atmosphere. So composting is kind of helping our carbon problem on both ends, right? We're reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that are being produced from landfills, and we're also absorbing more carbon from the environment or from our atmosphere by having healthier soil, which can soak in, can absorb that carbon and ultimately feed it to plants and microorganisms. And then, we've had a lot of rain lately. And so when we have healthy soil that can retain more moisture, it limits, like I said, it limits erosion, but it also makes flooding less serious. The soil can hold more of that water as opposed to just having it, filter out into our streets and our restaurants and all the other places that we've seen it the last few weeks. Okay, so let's talk about kind of the basic science. I've sort of talked about this high level, but I just want to give you guys a quick picture so you can see when food, so let's say we've got that apple, right? You eat an apple, you've got the core left. Now you're thinking like, what am I going to do with this apple core? You can do one of two things, right? You can throw it in the landfill. So you've got a landfill that has no oxygen or limited oxygen. And as a result, you're going to have anaerobic bacteria that are going to break down that apple over time. And when you take the nutrients in the apple without the oxygen and the anaerobic bacteria, they're actually going to create carbon dioxide and methane. And we know we do not want more carbon dioxide and methane in our atmosphere. We already have too much. When we compost, however, you end up with the apple, the oxygen, and that anaerobic bacteria, and they're actually going to create nutrients, a little bit of carbon dioxide, and water. So you can see if we're looking at like what are the two things that are coming out of, you know, the decomposition process, when we put that apple core either into a landfill or into a compost, we're much happier with the things that are coming out of the compost system as opposed to out of the landfill. And that oxygen is the biggest difference. Okay, and then I want to talk a little bit about, you know, some people say to me, why am I going to spend time on composting? Why would I do it myself? It's not that big of a deal. Why would I hire a service to do it? You know, what does that matter? How is it benefiting me? And I think the first thing is that individual action, I believe, really drives systematic change. And if we're all here, we probably believe that. If we're, you know, interested in plastic-free Delaware, we probably believe that already. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here. But, you know, one person composting isn't going to save the planet. But one person composting is going to get their neighbors to start asking questions, their neighbors to start being involved. And really, at the end of the day, what I hope that things like WasteWell can do are encourage enough people to talk to their legislators, talk to their municipalities, and get really larger community composting programs, either through you know, organizations or, like I said, through municipalities, so that this just becomes habit. You know, you separate your recycling and your trash. You put your trash, you know, everyone puts their trash at the end of their driveway. They're not leaving it all over their yard or whatever, right? We have systems, and hopefully composting can be sort of a third arm of that waste management system that's coming out of our houses that we just get used to. And I think at this point, composting is, there's a lot of questions about it. People don't understand it. It's not that easy. So by having some individuals that start to build that momentum, I think we can get to a point where, like I said, we tip the scales, and it becomes something where municipal systems make it easier for everybody to participate, which I think is the key, right? We need to make it easier for and simpler for everybody to do it. Okay, so let's talk about how you can get started at home. I'm a big believer that there's a way that just about everyone can compost. There is some way to compost that works for just about everybody. So how you compost or what system works for you will depend a lot on some different lifestyle considerations. And these are just some of the things to think about, right? So how much outdoor space do I have? If I want to compost at home, do I have enough outdoor space to have a pile or have a bin or have a tumbler? You know, depending on where you live and how big your yard is and things like that, you may or may not. What's the volume of waste? So there are some composting systems that are really easy to use and don't have a lot of volume options, right? They're very small, or you know, they might be really great for one person in an apartment, but they wouldn't work for a family of 6, for example. Maybe you've got a big yard and you can just throw everything in a giant bin. So volume of waste is another thing to consider. Time commitment. How much time do you have to maintain it? Is it something that, you know, you want to be turning a pile once every few days? Do you just want to be throwing it in some heap that's in the corner of your yard and letting it do its thing? Or maybe, like I said, you just want a service where you put it in a bucket, it's super easy, and someone just takes care of the process for you. So that's another thing to consider. Physical ability probably speaks for itself to a certain extent. Some people can turn a compost pile and some people can't. So maybe those things are, you know, there could be limitations in that perspective. Animal considerations. So it could be pets, it could be wildlife. This is like kind of a tricky one. So compost bins can attract animals depending on how they are managed. And when I say compost bins, I mean like an outdoor pile or outdoor bin. So putting a top on it with a lid can help, you know, a lid that's locked can help keep the animals out. If it's not managed properly, like they're going to come. So one of the things I try to think about is if animals are a real concern, then maybe an outdoor bin isn't necessarily the best option, because you really have to manage it pretty actively to keep the animals away. That's just an honest answer, right? Like if you're going to put food scraps in it. We have, for example, in our house, we have a pallet compost. Like it's just like 3 wooden pallets and you can sort of throw everything in there. We put our yard waste in there. That's not a problem with animals, right? But we don't have food scraps in there. So animal considerations can be an issue. The other thing I always sort of challenge people on is, do you care if the animals are getting in? So depending on where the compost bin is or what your family or lifestyle situation is, the animals may or may not matter. We have raccoons that get into our compost bin probably once a week, but it's pretty far from our house. They don't do any damage. It doesn't really bother me. They can come and it doesn't matter if there's raccoons in my compost bin. That's not going to be the same for everybody. So just something to think about, right? Like, is that an issue based on your particular circumstances? And then lastly, neighborhood rules. There are some limitations if you're living in a neighborhood that has an HOA, or you're living in an apartment building and they might be have restrictions about what you can have on your balcony, things like that. All right, so as we're going to go, we've got the next 3 slides. I just want to show you guys some different ways to compost, and we'll kind of go over them quickly. So if you have specific questions about them afterwards, I mean, even as we go through, you can just stop me, but just let me know if you have, like I said, specific questions about a particular one that looks interesting, and we can definitely stop and talk more about it. So if you're, I just want to sort of throw them all out there so you can have an idea of what exists. So we'll start with the most simple one to manage. That's a countertop appliance. There's one called a food cycler. There's another one called a Lomi. This is basically, you can see a picture. That's my kitchen with our food cycler sitting on top of the counter. It's a little electric machine. You throw food scraps in. You can put meat, dairy, oils, pretty much anything other than bones or things that it couldn't grind up. It dries it out, grinds it up, and then you can actually use it as a soil amendment. So you could put it in, your compost. You could sprinkle it on your garden. But with this one, the volume's kind of small, right? And it does take 6 to 8 hours of being plugged into a wall and running. So there's some pros and cons. Curbside pickup service. This is what WasteWell does. We bring you a 5-gallon bucket and you put your food scraps in there. And then once every 2 weeks, you leave that bucket at the end of your driveway or outside your door. If you live in an apartment building, for example, we empty that bucket, give it a clean swipe so it's not so dirty and gross, and we leave it to repeat the process. So that is a really easy option for someone who wants to reduce their waste, but just doesn't want to deal with the composting side of it. We do it all for you. Community drop-off. So there are places like farmers markets, community gardens, other collection sites. Sometimes they're free, sometimes there's a fee to use them. But this could be another option if you kind of want to collect your food waste. It tends to be less expensive than a curbside service. So it could be an option for someone who, maybe has the time to, or is going to the farmer's market anyways, and or lives near a community garden, but doesn't necessarily want to pay for the pickup service. All right, a neighbor's compost bin is always one that I recommend. If you've got a neighbor who composts and they are willing to share with you, you can compost for free and you don't have to do any of the hard work. And usually a neighbor who's composting is pretty excited about the extra material because they're going to get to use it in their garden or however they're using their compost. So that's another option. You got a neighbor who composts, ask if you can throw your food scraps in their bin. And then closed tumbler is a common option in the suburban areas, especially, or urban areas. It definitely helps keep, so that's the one in the middle. That's also in my yard. It's easy to maintain in the sense that you just throw the food scraps in and you turn the bin and it keeps the animals out, it locks. So we have not had any issues with animals getting into ours, but it can be a little bit more difficult to maintain in the sense that you don't have sort of nature involved in managing it for you. And nature does a really great job of managing nature, not surprisingly. So, you don't have the worms and the microorganisms coming up. You don't have the rain to keep it moist. There's less of that natural intervention that kind of helps the compost process. So you have to be a little bit more specific about and intentional about maintaining it properly and making sure you've got the right balance of greens and browns. But it is a good option if you're looking for something where you just say, I really can't have pests. I need something that's simple and clean. This can be a good alternative. There is some limited volume. So you can only compost what fits in the bin, and it tends to take a little bit longer to break down. You can do vermicomposting. So in-ground vermicomposting is what you see there is a picture of something called a subpod. And the subpod is something you can bury in the ground, or you can put it in a raised bed like you see there. And you buy some worms, and it's actually like worm composting in your garden. Again, this one's going to keep the animals out. That is also in my yard. So I like to try a lot of different composting systems so that I can talk about them. So I have, you're looking at all the pictures of the different things that I do. But so this is another option for someone who maybe has a garden, wants the compost, but wants something that's a little bit simpler. And again, this is no pests. It looks clean. You can plant around it, so it can just really be an integrated part of your garden. You can sit on it, so it can act like a bench. So this is a good option for, like I said, for somebody who wants something that's sort of prettier and simple, but isn't, quite the full-blown outdoor compost system that we're all used to. Which leads us to that outdoor compost system. That's my son throwing things in the compost. So this is kind of your traditional compost system in terms of, there's a bin, it can have a top on it or not. You see two different options there. The right side is just a chicken wire, cheap chicken wire, a few bucks at Home Depot or something, and put it in a circle and just kind of keeps things contained. On the left is actually a repurposed rain barrel. So that's another option that somebody could use just to keep things contained. This is where the raccoons actually get in though. So like I said, if you're concerned about pests, this is something that if you manage it pretty actively, you can keep the pests away, right? If you bury the food scraps every time you add them, if you make sure that it's not too wet or not too dry. But it does take some active management to keep it clean. The indoor vermicomposting, basically you get a plastic bin, you put some worms in, put some paper scraps, put some food on top that's sort of cut up. Vermicomposting, I think there is kind of a learning curve. There's also that, some people are a little uncomfortable with like having pet worms in their house, basically, which I totally understand. So, but it is another option for someone who maybe has, has just indoor composting and doesn't have an outdoor option, or wants something really small to manage. And then lastly, bokashi. So bokashi is an airtight system that ferments all of your food scraps before sending it out into, before you would put it out in the compost bin. So bokashi is not a standalone system in the sense that, everything happens in this bucket and then all of a sudden you have this amazing finished compost. What it does is you put it in there, you put all the food scraps, including meat, dairy, oils, things like that, things that, may not go in an outdoor pile or may not go in a tumbler. You can put that all in the bokashi bin. It's airtight. You add what's called a bokashi starter, and that has like a lot of bacteria in it. The bacteria starts to break down and ferment those food scraps so that when you go and put them out into your outdoor pile, you can put them in an outdoor compost pile, you can bury them. They break down really quickly, and then they will feed the soil. They'll feed the soil from there. So bokashi system is kind of like an expedient step that you would use to make your compost break down faster once you put it outside, or make it ready to just bury it if that's what you wanted to do. So those are a few different systems. Which one is right for you? So we're always happy to like answer questions. We're always adding new content on the WasteWell site to kind of help you through the process of, I'd love to do this on my own, but I'm just not sure where to start, not sure what to do. So if you have questions, you can always reach out to us. You can send us an email, or we're on Instagram too, so you can send us a direct message on Instagram and we respond there. Any questions so far? People want me to stop and talk about anything specific based on kind of different why composting is important or systems? Okay, awesome. What can you compost? In general, you can compost anything that ever lived. So if it's, any type of organic waste can be composted. However, there are some types of organic waste that can maybe create a more challenging composting environment. So it's more challenging to manage or more likely to attract pests and things like that. So in any type of composting system that you have, you can always compost produce food scraps, eggshells, paper, cardboard, yard waste, leaves, grass clippings, things like that. Sometimes, depending on the system that you use, you can compost meats, dairy, oils, and what I would call compostable plastics. So I'm sure you've probably seen these bioplastics. There's sometimes, there's bags, there's utensils, there's bowls and plates, there is packaging, a bunch of different things. We're seeing more and more of it as companies begin to be sort of more mindful of the waste impact of their packaging. And those compostable plastics, some of them can be composted in a backyard bin. If they're not something you would put in like a bokashi bin or an electric composter, it would, gunk up those systems. So generally these compostable plastics will have some sort of indication on them to say they're either compostable in a backyard or home composting system, in which case, we could take it at WasteWell. You could put it in your backyard bin. There's also some types of things, and compostable utensils is a good example of things that are really only compostable in an industrial facility. So they're not something that's really going to break down in any sort of efficient manner in a backyard bin. It just doesn't get hot enough. Yes, so also Tree just made a good point. So it has to be labeled as compostable and not just biodegradable. Thank you for that, Tree. That's a good comment. So those two things are very different. So compostable means there's actually a regulated definition of compostable, and that means that something will break down in, I think it's 180 days or something like that, but it will break down in a set period of time in sort of standard backyard bin conditions. Everything is biodegradable, pretty much. Biodegradable just essentially means that something will eventually break down over time. And even plastics will break down after hundreds of years. We don't want them in our landfills for hundreds of years, though. So biodegradable is a term that gets sort of thrown around pretty loosely, and in my opinion, doesn't carry a whole lot of weight, just because it's not regulated. So we don't really know what it means when people are using it. So it's kind of a word, using it doesn't mean that something's bad or wrong, but there are enough people using it in sort of wishy-washy ways that it's kind of lost any sort of reliability. So those are two things. That's a good thing to point out, right? Compostable and biodegradable are not the same thing. And then we're never going to compost things like plastics, metals, produce stickers. That's a big one. Produce stickers are, I think I've heard some people say that they're starting to see compostable produce stickers, which would be fantastic. But most of the time they're just plastic. So I can't tell you how many times I have gone through even my own compost, because sometimes we forget to take them off. And you're like, oh, this compost looks so great. And there's a produce sticker that looks like it's brand new. So they just don't break down. So you got to take your produce stickers out of your compost before you send them along. So, all right, next up. Oops, I missed one. Okay. So greens and browns, this is where we're going to talk a little bit about what goes into a compost pile. So a compost pile, a successful compost pile, needs 4 things to break down properly. It needs greens, browns, oxygen, and water. And so, okay, so Dee actually says that organic produce generally has compostable stickers. That would be awesome if that's in fact the case, which I will trust her. I'm not sure how to know the difference though. So, but yeah, so maybe they say compostable on them. If they do, that would be awesome. Can you guys hear the pounding in the background? Hopefully not, or hopefully not too much. Okay, so greens and browns, like I said, your greens are going to be your nitrogen-rich elements. So there are things like food scraps, grass clippings. They're called greens, even though they're not all green, because a lot of them are green. Leaves, grass clippings, like I said, any of your produce scraps, all are going to be high in nitrogen, and that, it's helpful for the bacteria and the feeds the bacteria that's in there. The browns are going to be your carbon-rich elements, right? So you need nitrogen, carbon, water, and oxygen. The browns are that second piece, that carbon-rich element. Browns can be everything from cardboard, paper, dried leaves, sawdust. Typically, it's things that come from trees. And so, if it's sort of a byproduct of a tree, usually that's, other than leaves, that's going to be a brown. So browns are high in they're rich in carbon, they tend to be dry. And so the browns and the dryness of the browns balance out the wetness of the greens. So you need the nitrogen, you need the carbon from those two things, but also the wet and the dry kind of help to balance each other out. So oftentimes I'll tell someone, if you have a really wet compost bin, like it looks really wet and slimy, you probably don't have enough browns, and those browns will just suck up all that moisture and bring your compost right back to balance. All right, so let's see. And the other thing that I want to point out, if someone is managing their own compost bin, there's all sorts of like articles and books that talk about these magic compost ratios. And I'm not really a big fan of them. The reason being, I'm sure, from a scientific perspective, there is this magic ratio of carbon to nitrogen. And if you're managing, a professional commercial composting facility, you're going to really care about those carbon versus nitrogen ratios. But if you're in a backyard compost bin, for example, there's wildly different amounts of nitrogen in, say, a banana peel versus a spinach leaf versus a grass clipping or coffee grounds, which is also considered a green, right? So the amount of nitrogen in those things is vastly different from one thing to the next. And that's the same is true for browns. So the amount of carbon in a newspaper versus sawdust versus shredded office paper versus dried leaves is also wildly different. And so for us in our backyard to try and marry this perfect ratio of carbon to nitrogen would involve us understanding, how much carbon is in sawdust versus cardboard, and how much nitrogen is in coffee grounds versus banana peels. Like, I don't know that. So really what I tell people is to manage the balance based on what it looks like and how it smells. And that's all you need to know. If, like I said, if you're managing some sort of commercial composting process, that's out of my scope. But from a backyard bin or just an individual or resident managing their own compost, I always say, take a peek, take a whiff, and you will know if your compost bin is in good shape. So, all right, let me go real quickly. Okay, so I think I showed you guys that list. We probably already covered this for the most part. Technically, anything can be composted. Generally, things like meat, dairy, and oils can attract animals. They can slow down the decomposition process. They tend to just be, like I said, they tend to kind of gunk up the process if we're just trying to manage compost on our own at home. So we encourage people to steer clear of those things. Like I said, they can be composted. They will break down. They won't contaminate a compost pile in the sense that it would have chemicals, harsh chemicals or anything like that in it. But it's probably going to make the process hard to manage and maybe a little bit smelly. Oh, sorry, I forgot. At the bottom, there's a link there. So one thing that we do have on the WasteWell site, and this is for anybody who's our customer or who's managing a bin on themselves, if you go to that link, Can I Compost, we have a little kind of what I call an interactive tool. And it's a whole list of all sorts of different things that you can compost. And each one, you hit a little plus sign, and it will tell you whether or not you can compost it with WasteWell and whether or not you can compost it in a backyard compost bin. And then it gives a little bit, like a paragraph or two about each item to kind of say why it would compost, why you can compost it or not, what are some things to look out for, things like that. So go ahead and check that out. And if you have stuff you want us to add to that list, we're always building it and happy to put more things on there. So hopefully that is helpful. All right, so let's get into that what if type of situation. And this is what I was talking about earlier. So take a peek, take a whiff, and dig in. How do I know if my compost is actually working? So first of all, take a peek at your compost pile. It should be a little bit damp, but not soaking wet. If it is soaking wet, you need to add more browns to dry it out. And if it's really dry, you can either add more greens or you can water it a little bit. So again, we get back to if it's too dry, that means you're short on nitrogen or short on water. So add a little bit of that. If it's too wet, it means you're short on browns. So go ahead and add some browns, dry it out, give it some more carbon. It'll create the browns, help to create structure and volume in your compost pile. So like I said, take a look, see what it looks like, and then make some adjustments accordingly. You can fix just about any compost pile with some minor adjustments. Take a whiff. Compost shouldn't stink. It should actually smell like kind of this sweet, earthy smell. I think it actually smells pretty good. Maybe that's just me. But if it smells acidic or if it smells like trash, it's probably too wet. And like I said, again, you need to come back and add more browns. So smell it. Don't stick your head in the bin, but you'll know. Like give it, just give it a little whiff and say, does it smell sweet? Does it smell earthy? Probably on the right track. If it stinks or it smells acidic, you probably need to add more browns, and you can fix that. And then dig in. So dig into your compost bin. Do you see earthworms? Do you see microorganisms? Do you see bugs crawling around? That's a good indication that your compost is active and decomposing. At the very end, when you have a finished compost, you'll see that a lot of those microorganisms will leave. Well, you won't see the microorganisms, but the worms will leave and the bugs will leave and things like that, because there's nothing left for them to eat. But as it's processing, you should see life in your compost bin, and then you will know that things are going pretty well. Lastly, those pesky pets. Again, we kind of already touched on this, so I'll be pretty quick about it. Will they attract, can it attract compost? Can a compost bin attract animals? Maybe. Does it matter? We sort of talked about that, right? It depends on your particular living situation. So I would just think about, does it matter? Some people just say, oh, I can't have pests. And then I say, well, does it really matter? And they say, actually, maybe not. Pets, I mean wildlife, but you know what I mean. And then if you are in a situation, and there's plenty of valid reasons why you just can't have, wildlife or animals getting into your compost bin, some good alternatives are a curbside collection like WasteWell, an electric composter, the sub pod that we talked about, and an elevated tumbler. So those are 4 good ways to compost if you want to, that will pretty much ensure you don't have issues with pests. So, and that's it. So I'll leave some time for questions for you guys. If you want to, if you've got questions about anything specific, I'm happy to help.
Jen, that was great. It really was comprehensive and it really gave us a lot to think about. I thought that was quite enlightening.
Great.
If anybody has any questions, you don't need, just jump in. You don't need to raise your hand or whatever.
Hey, Jen, I've got a question.
Yeah, Stephanie.
I read somewhere recently, I don't remember where, that it's not advisable to put citrus or onion, or maybe it's onion, I don't know if it's onion or onion skins in compost. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So citrus and onion skins will be fine in your compost bin, in like a general compost bin. Here's the issue with citrus and onions. It's the same issue. They're very acidic. And so if you put compost and if you put tons and tons of that into a bin, it can get too acidic for the worms. Mm-hmm. So in a vermicomposting system, those are going to be much more sensitive because you're specifically relying on worms and a lot of worms. Those are going to be much more sensitive to your citrus peels and your onion skins. If you're putting it in a regular outdoor bin or something that has lots of other things going into it, it's not specifically a vermicomposting bin, go ahead and add your onions and your citrus are going to be just fine. If you have an orange, if you have an orange, what's the word I'm looking for? Orchard is probably not the right word, but yeah, if you have an orange tree, right, and you're making orange juice and you have 100 orange peels, you probably don't want to put 100 orange peels in your compost all at once. But if you're just eating oranges along with all the other food that you're eating in your house, citrus is not a problem at all to put in a compost bin. You can even put a little bit of it in a worm bin. It will take a while for the worms to eat it, so you want to be more careful in a vermicomposting system, not to overwhelm it with citrus. But they won't. I don't think any of us are eating enough citrus that it's going to be a problem in a regular compost bin. So awesome. there is some truth. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, there is some truth to that. But I think it's kind of been, worms don't love acidic environments, which is the sort of true component. But you're not going to have a problem with just a little bit of citrus here and there.
That's awesome. Can I ask another question?
Absolutely.
We do a lot. We've got a backyard bin with a lid on it. and give it a stir pretty regularly. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think what you said is totally fine for us with the citrus and the onions. The other thing we do is we like to make chicken wings.
Yeah.
And so we have lots of little chicken bones. What do we do with those?
Okay, so you shouldn't put chicken bones directly in your compost. And
Right.
I'm going to follow up with you on that one because I have seen just recently, like just a couple weeks ago, and I haven't looked into it a bunch. I saw another sort of composting nerd like me talking about biochar. And she has a special tool that she uses, and she basically chars up the compost, chars up the bones, and then can put them in the compost. But let me get back to, I'll send a link to Tree and she can like send it out to you or to whoever else. And I'll get some more information on it because I remember seeing it. It was just a couple weeks ago. And I was like, oh, I wonder, what you can do with that. But for now, you shouldn't put those bones in your compost bin just as they are, like straight after eating the chicken wings. They'll take forever to break down, but more importantly, they'll probably attract the animals and have that smell like most meat products.
Yeah, we've been landfilling. We've been washing up the extra meat off of our chicken bones and then landfilling the bones.
Okay.
I don't want to continue to do that. It feels like there's got to be a better way somewhere. So
for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I just popped my email in there if you want to get back to me directly.
Okay.
Awesome.
Awesome.
So much.
Yeah. I'm going to put this.
And it's someone else's
turn. Here, let me write this down real quick because I feel like when I leave this, I'm not going to have the chat anymore.
Or if you forget it, you can just email me and I'll and for some reason all of a sudden I became D Durham. I'm not sure why on my thing, but it works.
I have a question, Tree, that's why.
Yeah.
Oh, D, you are on. Are you on
Yeah.
you're on as me.
I'm on as you now, really?
Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah.
So you made it on, D. That's good.
Yeah, I've caught like, I don't know, last 20 minutes or so. So it's been great, Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I'm really, really excited about what you said about neighborhood composting because, I'm sure you probably know in Delaware, we've been wrestling with the whole composting issue, and we do not have, actually, I don't even know if Philly does, but I know Maryland does, and DC has industrial composting, and we used to, but we had 2 attempts that both failed, and so now Delaware does not have industrial composting. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't appear anywhere on the horizon to be an imminent thing that's coming along. So I really think that like what you're doing with WasteWell and curbside pickup, and also what you mentioned, neighborhood composting is, something we can do immediately to encourage. Yeah. And but I love the idea of neighborhood composting. So I'd love to learn more about that, if you can expand on that. But also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that it's actually illegal to do that in Delaware. But
it is?
DNREC needs to, DNREC, it requires a permit, which probably isn't cheap.
You need to put your food scraps in your neighbor's bin? Are you talking about putting, when I talked about putting your food scraps in your neighbor's compost bin?
But like even maybe expanding on that a little bit, and like a neighborhood getting together to have a neighborhood composting operation, like still small scale, but a group effort.
Sure. I'm going to be honest. I don't know a lot about the regulatory requirements related to neighborhood composting. It's not something that I've looked into a ton. I'm sure you're totally right that they are very different in different places. I don't know what Philly has either in terms of like what the regulations are or anything like that. So that's definitely an opportunity to learn more about and to get some more information on. At this point, I just said, I know I have some friends and they're like, oh, my neighbor composts, so I just like throw my scraps in her bin and like that's fine. So it's just been much more informal than that. But have you tried?
Do you have any, for your WasteWell pickups, do you have any groups that sort of combine together to have, and then have you pick it up?
We don't have like a system necessarily, but you're more than welcome. So the way that we would encourage you to do that is to have one person sign up, and then you can get multiple buckets. And so like I think I actually have one customer who does this, and she didn't say specifically, but I'm pretty sure this is how it works. I think she and her neighbors share a subscription, and then they just put the buckets at the end of one driveway. So like when basically our pricing works is $18 a month for one bucket, and then every additional bucket is $5 after that. So you could get together with your neighbors and have one plan that has, say, like 5 buckets, and then as long as we're coming to the same place to pick them up, it's a lower pricing option because you're only paying $5 for each additional bucket instead of $18 for a full membership. And then you'd have like one customer account that you would access. So it would be managed like one customer, but you know, you can have additional buckets, and you're more than welcome to store those at neighbors' houses, however you feel. So that's kind of what we recommend if neighbors want to kind of get into it together. But if you have some other ideas about things that you'd be looking for, we could definitely, you know, I'm open to brainstorming.
Well, like you mentioned, like farmers markets and stuff like that being drop-off points. Do you do anything like that?
So I don't yet. I've actually talked to, there are some companies, like, so there's a company called Back to Earth, which is another very similar curbside composting company that serves kind of like Montgomery County, Bucks County area. They do farmers markets, and I've talked to Kennett Farmers Market a little bit about it. I know you guys have a farmers market. Is it Newcastle County Farmers Market? I have thought about the idea. The honest answer right now is I just don't have the bandwidth to do it, but that doesn't mean that, you know, if there's interest, you know, it's a great growth opportunity. So it's a conversation, like I said, I started having it with Kennett Square Farmers Market, and they were interested, and, you know, that's definitely another option if there's interest for people to do that. And the way that the pricing typically works for that is you get a bucket and you basically pay like $5 for the bucket. And then when you come back, you empty the bucket and then you pay another $5 for the new bucket, right? So like it's $5 for each bucket that you want to empty, and that covers our processing and transportation fees. That's going to be slightly less expensive than you know, about half the price of the monthly subscription if we came and picked it up at your house.
So the individual person pays $5, gets a bucket, and then they bring it to the farmer's market or wherever and dump it.
Yes.
And then you just have to come there, as long as the timing works out and everything, obviously, for your, like if you're doing it once a week or once every other week.
Yeah.
It would have to be on your timeline that the farmer's market is open the same day or whatever, right?
Yes,
so
exactly. So yes, correct. So we would basically kind of do like a vendor.
I love that idea. I love that concept of sort of partnering, you know, with existing operations, kind of, you know.
Yeah, it's something a lot of curbside companies do. It's definitely a viable option. I think I've hesitated so far. Like, we're pretty new, right? I just started in October of 2020. Right. So we're still, you know, in the sort of growth or early growth phases. It's something that I would definitely be open to, but I think but I really want to understand, you know, what are you guys looking for? What kind of interest is there? Things like that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to help spread the word any way I can, and help you grow your business, and
absolutely,
you know,
I appreciate it.
Spread the gospel, kind of, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Any other questions?
Thank you. That's great.
Sure.
I don't think so. Well, with that, Jen, thank you. And we'll be in touch.
Absolutely.
I do think that the continuing of growing your business and doing something, maybe neighborhood composting, or we'll figure out how to make it work within Newcastle County, maybe for some future avenues in which to go. So with that, I think we will end this, since I am now Dee Durham and Dee is Tree Sullivan. It's very exciting. I feel like we
Zoom magic.
It is Zoom magic. Well, thanks again. And we'll send this recording out. If anybody, just email me. Well, I'll just email it to other people that tried to log on and weren't able to for some reason. So sounds good. Thanks, Jen. Right. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Thank you. See ya.
Take care.